I had emailed your daughter. Is that right?
Yes, Angela.
Oh,
Hmm.
okay. And she takes care of like public relations stuff for you?
Yeah, she's my assistant, Girl Friday. She just kind of does everything. Um, Not related to software.
Yeah. Do you find does she get a lot of inquiries coming her way?
Oh yeah, quite a few.
Yeah. How many of these interviews have you done? Do you know?
Dozens and dozens and dozens.
Yeah.
I usually don't say no.
Mhm,
If an hour-long interview, that's easy for me to do. So,
mhm. Nice. What do you like these days? Are you still writing or working for a company or leading your own company?
oh no, no, no. I've been completely independent for the last since 2008. So, good long time. Um, and I do a lot of writing. I do a lot of talking, speaking. I conduct courses online. Usually, I don't travel. Once COVID kicked in, I pretty severely curtailed my travel.
Mhm,
Every once in a while, I'll go somewhere, but not very often.
mhm,
I still write quite a bit of code, but it's all my own for my purposes and educational or something around the office or something like that. So that's what fills my time.
Okay. What's the furthest you've traveled?
The furthest I've traveled, probably South Africa. I did
Mhm.
a talk in South Africa. Oh, geez, it was a long time ago. I can't
Yeah.
remember exactly when, but 8, 9 years ago, something like that. I've gone as far east as Serbia, Finland. I haven't gotten much further east than that. So I've never been to China, never been to India. Those are very long, horrible trips. I've been invited many times, but it would take a lot to get me to go.
Mhm. That's really cool. You've been to Serbia. That's actually where my family's from, Macedonia and Serbia or
Oh
former
yeah,
Yugoslavia. Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny enough, my parents are there right now, actually. So it's
is
funny
that
you
right?
mentioned that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a conference that was out there, and it was run by a couple of young women, and boy, dynamic as can be. Of course, the whole area is war torn every decade or so.
Hmm.
So when they're between wars, they fight really hard to make a living. So it was great to see them. They had a lot of enthusiasm. They took us on a whirlwind tour of the whole country
Hmm.
because we made several stops. Had some of the best food I've had in my experience.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. Yeah. I do like the food from over there. Bob, really quick before we start, because I actually did start recording, I'm going to give you a proper introduction.
Yeah, that's no problem.
For everybody out there listening, hi, my name is Chris. This is Chee-Tash, and today we have a very special guest, somebody who actually we have been doing book summaries of on the YouTube channel. And you can catch those chapter summaries on there of both Clean Code and the Clean Coder. Today we have Uncle Bob C. Martin. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Um, can I call you Bob or
Yeah, of
Robert?
course.
Yeah.
Bob. Yeah.
Really quick, can you give just a brief introduction on yourself and your background?
Oh heavens. Started programming 1964 probably. I was 12 years old. My mother bought me a little plastic computer. I learned how to make it work. And that set me on the course of my life. I've been a programmer for a very, very long time. Done a lot in my early career. I did a little bit of COBOL, God help me. Then went right into assembly language. I spent a long time writing assembly language in the 70s and in the 80s for embedded real-time systems and measurement systems and highly and technically engineering-based systems. Transitioned eventually into C. Fell in love with that language right around 78. Pushed my company to adopt it. Um, just enjoyed the heck out of that language. Eventually saw C++, and I thought that was the wave of the future. So I adopted that. I started learning about object-oriented programming and stuff like that. Right around, 1988 or so, I'd been in the business a good long time, and I decided to hang out a shingle, become a consultant, and I started conducting courses and traveling the world and yelling at people and telling them they were doing everything wrong. And that's really been my life ever since. I founded a company or two, and some of them have done okay, and some of them didn't. And now I'm 72 years old and semi-retired, I guess, although I work an awful lot. Still writing a fair bit of code, writing books, writing articles, blogs. I tweet a fair bit. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
I do follow your Twitter account too, actually. I was gonna, if we have time, I was gonna ask you about that later.
Oh yeah, it's
Um,
fine.
what is actually the origination of your nickname, the Uncle Bob name?
Yeah, that was 1985, no, 1988-ish. I was working at a company called Clear Communications. We were writing C on Spark stations and Unix and dabbling around with this new graphical user interface stuff. And there was a guy there named Billy Fogel, and he had a nickname for everybody, and I was Uncle Bob. And anytime he addressed me, it would always be Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob, come here, Uncle Bob. Can you answer this question for me, Uncle Bob? And it really grated on my nerves. Didn't like it at all. Eventually, I left that company and started working. I actually went to Rational for a while, working with Grady Booch and those guys. And nobody called me Uncle Bob, and I started to miss it. So I made the mistake of putting it in my email signature. And I was pretty well known on the internet in those days. Back before there was Facebook or Twitter, we had a different kind of social network called Usenet. And that my email signature kind of got around. And I eventually wound up at conferences and people would call out my name, Uncle Bob. And I thought, okay, I guess this is a good brand. I think I'll adopt it. So that's where it came from.
It is. It makes you like really stand out, and it's like very memorable. I don't call too many people my uncle, so that's
Well,
now that first computer that you mentioned that you got as a kid. I know in one of your books you talked about it too. Can you explain how that exactly worked? Because I found that really fascinating.
oh, sure. Is this a video?
It'll actually just be audio.
It's just audio. Okay. So, otherwise I could take it down off the shelf and show it to you live. It's a very simple plastic machine. It has three sliders. The sliders have two states, left and right, and there's a little window off to the side that'll show a one or a zero, depending on what state the slider is in. The slider has the sliders sit in a frame, and the frame has these rods that are tensioned with rubber bands, and they will slide into grooves on a clock that slides back and forth. So when you cycle this machine, you cycle this clock. Um, what would I call this thing? It's a plane that sits below all the sliders, and it has grooves on it that move those rods in and out. But they can be blocked if there happens to be a tube, a little soda straw tube that the programmer has put on a peg on the sliders. So if the sliders are in a certain configuration, the rods will slip into the groove and enact a mechanism that will change the state of the slider. Now, if you work that through in your head, that's an AND gate, and it's an AND gate that can change the state of a flip-flop. And there were six of those rods. So this was a machine that had six AND gates that could change the state of the flip-flops in six ways. It's a 3-bit finite state machine with six AND gates. And with that, you can do a hell of a lot. I mean, you could program it to count in binary. You could count up. You could count down. You could add. You could add 2 bits. You had to take out two of the AND gates and replace it with an OR gate to do that. That was a funny little plastic thing that unified two of the AND gates. But otherwise, it was very straightforward. You could do a lot of very interesting logical manipulations. And the machine absolutely fascinated me because it would do these things that you would expect only a human could do, like count. And I was 12 years old, so computers were like magic to me. And here's this little plastic thing doing those things. And I decided I needed to understand it in detail. So I went through an awful lot of effort making sure I understood every little bit of that machine. And in that activity, I realized that I was going to be a programmer.
Is that something that people can still buy today?
No, the company that made them was called Educational Research. They made a number of educational toys. This machine was called the Digicomp 1. And there are a number of them out there. You can go on eBay and buy them, and you'll pay a pretty penny for them nowadays. They also made a number of other toys. There was one that played the game of Nim, which if you're a follower of Numberphile or the one of the other mathematics YouTubers, Matt Parker. He actually showcased that on one of his videos. But there were a number of these tools that they made, these toys that they made, and then they went out of business, as they do, probably around 1968 or 69.
Oh, wow. Okay.
There are other people who have made models of it, mostly out of cardboard, laser cut cardboard. They're not as good as the original plastic.
Mm.
There are also simulators online.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
so if you look up Digicomp 1 and you'll run into some GUI driven by JavaScript that'll make the thing work for you.
Oh, that's cool. I'll have to check that out. Now, another thing I've read in your books is you talking about your experience working for other companies, and you have a lot of anecdotes about that. And what was what was the very first company you worked for again, as far as the space of software engineering development?
At the age of 16, I was hired by a company in Lake Bluff, Illinois. This is where I lived, my hometown. And this company was an insurance actuary, but they had a division where they had some computers. They had some IBM 360s and Honeywell 200s and things like that. And my father strode in there as he was wont to do in those days, and told them, "You will give my son a job over the summer," and they did. And it was a temporary job. I think I was there for 3 weeks, and most of the time I was just updating manuals in a little closet. They stuffed me in a closet and said, "Here, update these manuals." But at one point, one of the programmers there took me aside and gave me a manual on Easy Coder, which was the assembly language of the H200, the Honeywell 200 machine, and then asked me to write a small program, which I did, and I wrote it wrong, and he corrected me, and then he walked me through the whole process of how do you compile it and how do you run it. Of course, that's going up into the computer room and dealing with a multi-million-dollar machine with the operator touching the machine and the two programmers, the one program and me, the junior guy, standing off to the side. But we got that program to work. We went downstairs. We looked at the listings, the dump listings of the tape that was eventually generated. Yes, it worked great. And the guy smiled and shook my hand and said, "That's great. Now I have to let you go." And I left that job. That was the end of that job. I went back to that company a year and a half later as an offline printer operator at third shift. I'm 18 years old. Um, what do 18-year-olds do, right? Got to pay for that car somehow. So I'm printing junk mail, but there are a lot of programmers going around, and I would talk to those programmers, and eventually got hired as a programmer to write COBOL, which was awful, and then assembly language, and I've got involved with a project to write from the bottom up a a, a real-time accounting system for the Truckers Union Local 705 out of Chicago. in assembly language on a mini computer that, of course, doesn't exist anymore, a Varian 620F, 16-bit mini computer.
Wow.
That would have been in 1969,
Oh, geez.
70,
Okay.
something like that.
So, and the company that you mentioned, is that company still around today?
Well, the original insurance actuary, I believe, is. But the little spin-off, which had computers, that was a client service bureau. And in those days, computers were so expensive that most businesses could not afford to have one. So what they would do is they would buy time and programmer time, computer time and programmer time from the service bureau, and the service bureau would run these programs, these applications on their very large machines, which my Apple Watch is better than, and they would pay a lot of money for that. So those kinds of companies are long gone. Right nowadays, the closest semblance we have to that kind of company are the cloud companies,
Hmm. Okay. AWS, GCP. Yeah.
but very, very different. I mean, they don't write code for you; they just give you computer time and a lot of it, and you don't have to buy the
Mhm.
machines.
So I know you've probably had a lot of different jobs at a lot of different companies. Is that fair to say?
Oh yes.
Yeah. When would you say, because another concept you talk about in your books is about professionalism, like when would you say you first considered yourself like a professional software engineer?
Ooh, boy. Well, the problem with that is that my definition of professional software engineer has changed a great deal since those days. So had you asked me at the age of 22 if I was a professional software engineer, I would have said, well, of course I am. If you ask me now, looking back on my behavior as I was 22 years old, I would scream in horror at the very thought. No, I made a tremendous number of mistakes in those days. That was, by the way, that was how we all learned because nobody knew. Nobody knew what this programming stuff was or how to do it well or what it even meant to do it well. So we were all in the very heavy learning stages back then. Um, when did I first become aware of the need for professionalism? Might be a question that would answer that a little bit better.
Mhm.
And that would probably be 1988 or 89, at my fourth job, I think, something like that. The same job where Billy Fogel named me Uncle Bob, by the way.
Oh, cool.
And I really got involved with the social network on the internet at the time, the Usenet social network. And through that mechanism, I was able to meet an enormous number of people flung all over the world and began to realize that the world of programming was A, much larger than I thought, and B, in great need of maturity. Put it that way.
Do you think back then the greater, let's say the greater scope of a company, did people tend to think of software engineers as professionals, or did that take a while for people to start to say, hey, okay, these people are professionals?
That's also an interesting question. It seems to me that in the first jobs I worked at in the very late 60s, um, it was a very professional environment. People came in, they wore ties, they were dressed well. It was very, business dress, not even business casual dress. It was business dress. The offices were nice. There was a large demographic. The programmers were primarily older. They were in their 30s, 40s, 50s. I was obviously the youngest because I was 18, but there wasn't even anybody in the gap between me and say a 30-year-old. It's like there's all of a sudden there were these 18-year-olds and then there's all these adults.
Mhm.
So in those days, it felt to me as an 18-year-old, it felt to me to be a very professional environment, a business-oriented professional environment. That shifted, and it shifted very rapidly in the 70s. In the 70s, it became an environment of 20-year-olds, 20, 22, 25, 27. The vast majority of programmers were male. That was a change, by the way, because the very first job I had, there were a fair number of female programmers. But that shifted, and it shifted hard. It went really hard into 20-year-old males, 22-year-old males, young boys, full of energy, full of testosterone, gonna conquer the world. And it was not a professional environment anymore, at least not a business professional environment. It was more of a fraternity environment.
Mm, okay. I see what you're saying. Do you think looking at companies today, has that has that improved, or has it stayed the same, or has it gotten worse, do you think?
Well, I think it's gotten better. Well, I think it's gotten better in general. I think there is a patina of professionalism, but the fraternity feel really hasn't gone away.
Mm,
It's primarily a male dominated field for whatever reason, and in at least in the United States, at least in the Western world, it is primarily male dominated, primarily young. So people in their 20s and 30s.
mhm.
Once you get into your 40s and 50s, people start to wonder why you're not a manager now. How come you're still a programmer? So there's a definite kind of pejorative or negative feel towards an older programmer. And then you get a little bit older than that, and then, well, you're out of date. Sorry, you don't know Angular anymore. You don't know any of these new things. You can't do all the whipty new acronyms. You're just an old dude, and we'll put you off in the corner, and you can smile.
Do you think that in this age, I will say for me, I work remotely ever since really COVID. And I used to go into our office before COVID, but then after COVID, we quickly pivoted. We're all remote work now. Even to this day, we don't have a mandatory, mandatory thing to come into work. I was wondering, do you think remote work has kind of uh, aided in that professionalism, or that it's not the fraternity aspect of it, or that it's not really gotten maybe as good as you think it should?
Oh my, I have a number of mixed feelings about offline work. It's obvious why businesses like it. I mean, if you don't have to buy the building, that's a big expense off the back of your finances. On the other hand, and it's great for the employee because the employee can sit at home and program in their pajamas. Um, on the other hand, boy, do you lose a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the team camaraderie, the ability to look in people's eyes, to actually be with people. That's a huge loss. And I'm not sure how this is all going to settle out. My preference would be to return to the days of the office where people congregated and worked together, and we only allowed homework once a week, a day a week, 2 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
You can work from home, but you got to be in the office at least some of the time, and that's where my preference would lie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally I feel that too. I feel like when I was in the office and sitting next to people, it did feel different, and it felt more of a team atmosphere. And these days, we do the best we can, and I feel like I like the team that I'm on, and we work pretty good, but there are some challenges to it, and I'm curious to see what happens in the next few years. I mean, do you think there'll be a kind of reversion to the mean, and people will start to push back and get people back in the office?
I think as the economy tightens, the people running the companies are going to ask themselves, what are these people in their homes doing? We better get them here so that we know what they're doing. And we've seen that before. We've seen it happen where during times of really good high economy times, all the rules kind of relax. And then when things get tight, people look around and say, okay, we can't afford this nonsense. Bring everybody in, and we're going to deal with tough times.
Mm.
And that I think that's probably what's going to happen.
Mm. Now, going back to your background, as far as school and college, did you go to college and get a CS degree?
No, 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 no. I was a child of the 60s. And college in the 60s was, well, it was full of protests and bombs and it wasn't an environment conducive to actually learning anything. And I had already learned what I had wanted to learn about computers. I had already read books on COBOL and Fortran and PL1, and I'd played with PDP-8s and gotten jobs at ASC where I wrote COBOL and eventually assembly language. So I never had any need to go off to college. So never got a degree, and the lack of that degree never had any impact at all on my employment. Nobody ever said, "Oh, we can't hire this guy. He doesn't have a degree," because I'd walk in there and you know I could talk the talk. So I learned everything I needed to learn on my own, reading like crazy, absorbing as much as I could, not just about software, but about science and math and everything else that I have used in my career. I got involved with uh, very deep engineering companies, where we were testing the electronic characteristics of telephone wires. And I had to learn about impedance and conductance and susceptance and all of these interesting terms and had to come to terms with all of the electronic stuff and the mathematical stuff behind all of that. And it was a great experience for me. And I think I came out the back end with a pretty well-rounded college education without ever going to college.
When did you find, was there a switch in your career where all of a sudden people are starting to place more of an emphasis on getting a degree?
No, that was always there.
Yeah.
When from the time I entered the field, there were computer science degrees to be had. 10 years before that, there weren't, right? So you had to have some other kind of degree. But by the late 1960s, the early 1970s, you could get a computer science degree. You could go to the University of Illinois and work on the ILLIAC 4, right? And get a deep understanding of what computers were. So most companies said that they expected degrees. But the problem of finding enough programmers was large enough that most companies would wink and say, well, let's hear what you have to say anyway. And then once you talk to them, it's like, okay, never mind. College degree requirement waived. This is fine. And that situation really hasn't changed all that much. We'll go through periods where there's a glut of programmers in the workforce, and then everybody's going to stick to the degree. But the vast majority of years have a lack of programmers in the workforce, and so companies are always willing to look carefully and say, well, this guy's pretty smart. I think we'll take him anyway. So
Do you,
I know a number of people, many of
Mhm.
them my age, many of them younger, without degrees who are extremely well-known programmers, and you'd never know it.
So is it, would you say it's pretty much if you can prove that you know what you're doing, you can do the work, then that having that degree isn't like a obstacle for a company to hire you.
Yeah, I think that's true. You've got to get past the HR people, which usually isn't too difficult. And that's by the way, that's one of the reasons that all these boot camps kind of showed up. Because now you can go to a boot camp and spend, 13 weeks at a boot camp doing a little JavaScript, and then you can get a job. You don't
I
need a degree.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that in a second, because I did a coding boot camp. Funny enough,
Yeah.
but before that, and I know in one of actually in the Clean Coder, because I know I just read this chapter where you talked about CS degrees, and sometimes people who just because they have a degree doesn't necessarily mean they exactly know what they're doing. And I was wondering, like, in your experience, what's maybe like the biggest thing that somebody with a degree, let's say a CS degree, lacks when coming into the workforce? Or is there something that they tend to not have when coming into the workforce?
Oh yeah. Real world experience. Um, the way I've hired a number of people over the years, people with degrees, people without degrees. And the shock of realization as a young person leaves school and enters the workforce, and they realize that this is not like school. This is really different from school. That shock can be fairly significant. University does not do a very good job, at least most universities don't do a very good job of preparing the students for real life work. So, and I think the reason behind that is that most of the professors have never done real life work. Right? They don't know what it's like either. So you get into a job where you have to write code as your job, and it's not quite the same as the college experience.
And do you think, as far as once you get into like a real world job, you have to all of a sudden, deal with pressure. You have to deal with other people. Dealing with people maybe you don't even really jive with, and just working well together with teams. Like stuff like that can be kind of hard to replicate in a college setting.
I don't think it's difficult to replicate. I don't believe it is replicated very well. But I don't think it's difficult to replicate. I mean, some of the universities that do a good job at this are those that have their students go and work as interns at real live companies
Hmm.
for a semester. And then they come back with a rather different view on how things work. So I think it can be replicated, but not in the insular university environment. It has to be a kind of environment where you're looking outside at the business world, seeing how things are really done, and trying to prepare your students for that.
Mhm. Yeah, I to- I totally agree with that. Now, as far as the boot camp aspect, and I
Mm.
know that has been something that, yeah, I feel like has been a very popular thing. I took a boot camp 5 plus years ago now. And what are your thoughts on the boot camps that have popped up? And do you find like similarities between people coming out of a boot camp versus people coming out of a CS degree at a university?
Um, the folks coming out of boot camps have a very minimal amount of exposure, right? Just maybe you've written a little JavaScript or a little Java or something like that. You've gone through 13 weeks, and it's enough to get you started. But I don't think you come out with the confidence that a 4-year degree will give you. And that confidence is kind of a false confidence in the case of the 4-year degree. So I think you come out of the boot camp a little more humble than you'd come out of a 4-year degree. And so maybe the shock of entry is not quite as great. If you're coming out of a boot camp, you go in and you think, okay, I really don't know what the hell I'm doing, so I might as well pay really close attention. I um I remember interviewing. It just blew my mind. I interviewed. I was a young woman, um, masters in computer science. So my expectations were a little high. And I was talking to her, and she seemed to know her stuff pretty well, and she could talk the talk. And then I asked her to describe some of the projects she'd written code for, and she made the most incredible statement to me. She said, "Well, I've never actually written any code." And I thought, "Well, wait a minute. How, how do you get through a master's level CS degree and never write any code?" And she answered that question. She says, "Well, I did a lot of research." That blew my mind. That made me realize that there are pathways through university that are so completely alien to the workforce that they negatively impact the student, the candidate, the person with the degree. It's just unbelievable to me.
Yeah, wow. I've never I never coded anything. Wow. I would not expect an answer like that
No,
myself. Yeah.
no, I didn't either.
So now what do you tell like if somebody off the street is looking at colleges or looking to get into the industry and let's say they're saying, "Oh, I am looking at going and getting my bachelor's in computer science." Do you necessarily tell people to steer clear of that path, or how do you exactly advise somebody like that?
Well, my first advice is that it's not necessary. You don't have to get a degree to be a programmer. If you want to be a programmer in the United States of America, you can do it without getting a college degree. You can go to a boot camp, or you can go to a junior college, get an associate's degree. Usually, the community colleges, especially in the United States, the community colleges are gold mines. Those are places where you actually can learn. So you don't need to go all the way to the university to become a programmer. You could take that route, and I think it would be very effective, and you'd wind up as a programmer making the kind of money that programmers make. If you really want a bachelor's degree, and there are reasons to want that, then you've got to find a school that is very technical, right? Engineering oriented school, and focus on the engineering side of things. Get into it. Your education is your responsibility. It's not the professors. It's not the schools. They will let you go off into never never land. Right. So you have to be the one who focuses your education on the really high technical stuff. And there is good stuff to get, especially at universities like the University of Illinois or MIT or places like that. You can go there and you can learn a hell of a lot, and you can get exposure to really good stuff and make really good contacts. But it has to be you that does it, and you have to be willing to pay the price.
Hmm.
And right now the price is just so absurd. The tuition costs are so absurd that the economic trade-off is much more towards the boot camp,
Hmm.
much more towards the community college. Yeah, you're going to go $500,000 in debt to get through a 4-year school, 300,000 in debt, something like that, to get through a 4-year school, and you are not going to make a $300,000 worth of difference unless your career path is, to the moon. If you want to really shoot high, well, then maybe that 4-year degree is going to pay off. But if you want to be a programmer, like a good old programmer and have a nice job and earn a good living, it's not necessary.
Pivoting a little bit and looking at the entire industry today as far as, what's going on in the world at companies, etc. There's two things I wanted to ask you, and I'm sure there's a lot more going on too, but these two kind of stand out in my mind. One of them is I've been hearing a lot. I don't know about exactly today, right now at this moment, but I was hearing a lot about layoffs in the tech industry. And do you think, is that something that has come in waves, or has that been something that has happened also in the past that maybe you've experienced in your career?
Oh, sure. Sure. So layoffs. We had layoffs in the 70s during the OPEC oil embargo. We had layoffs after the dot-com bubble burst. That was a bad one. There was like 2 years where there were programmers out on the road, holding up signs, "We will code for food." But it's rare. It's very rare in our industry for there to be a programmer recession. It happens, but it's rare, and they're usually over fast. And the reason for that is that the demand for programmers cannot be satisfied. COVID threw a big monkey wrench into that because when COVID came around, the government gave gobs of money to companies, and programmers got hired. They got hired like bananas. The demand went through the roof. Everybody was staying at home, and so the social networking companies and the software companies were writing applications for these people at home, right? So it's just immense amounts of work. And then COVID ends, and all of a sudden, that demand is not quite there anymore. And so, okay, the layoffs began then. And then the interest rates start going up and the inflation starts happening, and everybody's looking around saying, there could be a recession. And it doesn't, it's like maybe there'll be a recession or maybe there won't. And we're not going to hire a lot of people right now because we're worried about that. And we wind up with more and more layoffs and more problems. That'll probably reverse in another year or two.
Going with that, the other thing I was going to ask you about as far as industry today is artificial intelligence, generative AI. And I know
I go
for,
there.
yeah, I know for myself, I have used these tools. I've used ChatGPT, I've used GitHub Copilot, and it's helped me out quite a bit in some stuff at work. Do you see that this area is just only, I mean, it seems like it's only going to get bigger and bigger. And my question is, something that I'm asking myself is it ever going to really interfere with my work to the point where anybody could use these tools to code? You don't really need me anymore. I I don't know if you've ever contemplated these things or what you think about that.
Well, it's a common fear, right? And just to give you an idea of how old that particular fear is, when Grace Hopper in the early 1950s first conceived of the idea of a compiler, and this was not a compiler that you and I would recognize as being significant in any way, it was more of an assembler. The programmers who were around at the time were struck by the fear that anybody could then write programs. This is a very old fear, and it's happened over and over again. We saw it in the 80s. Oh, the Japanese are going to take over with Generation 4. I, oh, Prologue. Oh, those Japanese, they're doing Prologue. It's going to wipe out all the programming. There was a book written in the late 90s by God, who wrote this book? A very well-known software consultant. And in the book, there was a picture of a dodo bird, and the caption was "The American Programmer circa 2001."
Wow.
Now that did not happen. So, okay, AI comes along. It's great. It's wonderful. We love it. It's a good search engine. It's fun to play with. And if you play with it long enough, you realize it's completely moronic, but it can help you. Makes a good search engine. You can ask it to write a little code. It'll do a halfway adequate, halfway inadequate job. You look at it and go, yeah, okay, well, I'll take that bit of it, but not that bit of it. And you use good judgment in the way that you adopt anything that these things tell you. And by the way, half the things they tell you are completely lies. They're just wrong. They don't intentionally lie, but these tools will very confidently tell you things that are absolutely wrong. So no, I am not concerned that programmers are going to be losing work to Copilot or ChatGPT 5.7 or whatever. That's not the issue. They will be good tools. They will be helpful tools. They will be a tool that is as good as Stack Exchange or Stack Overflow. right? It'll be a tool that's as good as a Google search engine. Imagine the revolution of the internet and the search engine. I mean, we don't look things up in books anymore. We just go, hey, how do I do this? And the machine will answer. And now ChatGPT will let you do that even faster. Fine. All of that is great. Programmers are always going to be necessary. Human programmers are always going to be necessary because human programmers are the people who deal with the details that business doesn't want to deal with. We are the ones who figure out whether or not there should be a page break in a report, or whether the column of numbers should be 3 or 4 digits wide. Oh, we're the ones focused on these really terrible details that the business people cannot afford to deal with. And if you go to ChatGPT and say, "Hey, write me an application and I don't need programmers anymore," well, then you're the guy who's going to be dealing with all those details, and you're going to have to hire someone to deal with those details for you because you don't want to deal with those details. And the person you hire to deal with those details will be a programmer.
I know I can say for myself, when I use these tools, I really do use it more like a search engine, like what you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah,
To give an example, just the other day, I had a question. We work in React. I had a question about the use ref hook. So I just, instead of going to Google, I actually use this other one. It's called pi.ai. And I typed it in there. It gave me like a few examples. Okay, now I kind of have a little bit of more of an understanding, and I started to work with it a little bit. But I am, to your point, I am careful if I ever tell one of these AI tools to say, hey, make me this. I usually don't do that. I usually really break it down and say, hey, can you give me an example of how I would use this small little component? And then from there, I work on it on my own. That's just kind of how I personally use it. So you've used these tools quite
Oh,
a
sure.
bit? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I use them. I use them all the time. I use them if I'm writing code and I'm using somebody's framework, and you get to this point in the framework where there's this argument you've got to pass in, and you don't know exactly what state this argument has to be in, and that you're looking through the documents and the documents don't tell you, and you go to Stack Overflow and Stack Overflow doesn't tell you, and you sit there and go, all right, what is the magic connotation that I have to put into this damn function call to get it to work? And you go to ChatGPT, and ChatGPT says, "Oh, just do this,"
Yeah.
and it works. And then you ask ChatGPT, "Where did you find that information?" And it won't tell you. It will not give you the source. It won't cite anything. It just gives you the magic, which worked in one case at least. Worked. And I'm left like, yeah, but I still don't understand anything. I want to know why this worked, and I can't get the citing that tells me. But I do. I use them all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I use them to look up quotes. So I remember that somebody said this. So I'll go to ChatGPT and say, who said this? And it'll give me an answer that I think, no, that's not right. So then I'll reword it just a little bit. Who said it this way? And then they'll give me a completely different person. And then eventually, by doing that, I get a couple of names, and then I go back to Google and I put those names in, or DuckDuckGo is actually what I'm using nowadays. And then I'll get the references, and I can put it in my book and cite it properly. But it's a very good, for me, it's a very good first search that allows me to do more detailed searches using more traditional means.
Now, earlier I had mentioned I follow you on Twitter, and I take a look at your tweets and what other people tweet or reply to you. And I do find that there's some people who are critical of like your ideas from your books.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And do you find, are people critical in that they don't think, looking maybe at, clean code or the clean coder that's what you write about is not applicable today? Is that kind of where some of the criticism lies?
there are three kinds of critics that I encounter. And the first one is the clickbait critic. The reason they are criticizing is to get the click, right? So, clean code blows chunks. Okay, now that's just clickbait. And maybe they wrote up a little article, but the article really doesn't have any substance. And all they really wanted was to get people to go to their website or whatever. Okay, that's number one. Number two, these are the people who are critical because they don't like it. And it's really all you can say. Well, I just don't like it. I mean, it's not the way I do it. And in my environment, this wouldn't work. And the performance is dismal. And so then you get that kind. And then there's this group, and this is the group that I really value. These are the people I cherish because they are honest about it. They'll say, now look, some of these ideas have these faults and these costs, and they will provide insights that perhaps I didn't have. And so I read those with a lot of care and a lot of respect. And if you watch the way I answer threads, you can tell if I'm in that mode, if I carry on a long-term conversation and really poke and prod at them. And I've learned a tremendous amount by doing that. The most valuable feedback for an author is honest negative criticism. I value that like crazy. So when I write a book, my publisher will send it out for review, and very often they'll choose positive reviewers. And okay, it's nice to get positive reviews. And then I send the book out to negative reviewers, people who have really disagreed with me over the years in a lot of different ways. People who may not like me very much, and I will send those chapters out or those manuscripts out to them to get honest feedback from them. And usually I do. I get very, very, very good, sometimes, very painful, but very good feedback from these people who disagree with me, but that I respect because they're honest about it.
Mm. That reminds me of, I don't know if you've heard of this book. It was written by a former FBI agent, Chris Voss. It was called Never Split the Difference. And it's about negotiation. And he has a chapter in the book where he talked about he actually wants, I think he said that he wants no's. So when you're in a negotiation, he actually wants to hear a no. I think he said no's are like 3 times as valuable as a yes, because then he's able to extract information from that no and get over like blocks or obstacles to coming to an agreement. He finds that usually when people say yes, it's more of something to kind of get you off their back. So, oh yeah, sure, I'll do that for sure. Yeah. But it's really just to get you to go away. And I find, like negative, it's kind of similar to what you're saying with negative criticism or feedback, as long as it's constructive and not clickbaity, that it allows you to, allows us to like learn or grow from that. Yeah, that's really cool. What advice would you have for, I know earlier we talked about some advice too, and on one topic, like for people who are struggling with, let's say, being productive in the workplace or being productive as far as studying for exams, what have you, do you have any tools to help with that?
Well, being productive. I got advice from a publisher 30 years ago. And the publisher said, if you're going to write a book, then make sure you write something in that book every day. Doesn't matter how much you write, even one sentence, but make sure you write in that book every day. Don't let it languish. Don't let it sit for weeks at a time. I thought that was interesting advice. Um, how to be productive, right? So never let it languish, never let your skills languish. Always, if you're working on something, do something on that something every day. The thing you do might be to just stop working on writing code and start working on learning something. You may have to learn something. It's okay to do that. Learn something. The most important advice for being productive is to never let the schedule be your master. You have to meet the schedule, but you cannot compromise your work in order to meet the schedule. What you have to do instead is make very careful trade-offs that don't damage the quality of what you're producing, but might reduce the functionality of what you're doing. So simple way to say that. Don't cram 8 features in if you're going to make a mess doing it. Cram 5 features in and do a good job with those 5 features.
Hmm.
And you will be much more productive that way. Because that mess you make with the 8 features is going to slow you and everybody else down for the rest of that project's life.
Now, as far as you and your future, do you have any new books that are coming out or that you're currently writing right now?
Just sent the final manuscript to the publisher for a book. The working title is We Programmers, and it's a history of programmers from going all the way back to Charles Babbage, and then to people like Grace Hopper and John von Neumann and Alan Turing and into Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson, all the way up to the 1960s. And then it transitions into what I saw from the 1960s until the year 2000s. And then finally, at the end, I make a bunch of silly predictions about what's going to happen in the future. So that book just went off to the publisher. Very different kind of book from what I'm used to writing. There's like almost no code in that book, although the book is really technical. The audience for this book is programmers, and so as I'm discussing these old programmers, I'm also describing the machines they had to use in a technical way. I get deep into the technology. I show some of the code that they had to write and some of the loops that they had to jump through in order to get anything done. So it's a very technical book, but it's not modern code. Nobody would read this book to learn how to do Dart programming, for example. This is about old stuff, but very technical. And the goal behind that book is we, especially the young people today, need to realize that they're standing on the shoulders of a fair number of people who came before them and the struggles that those people went through to get these people to where they are today. And where we are today is just incredible. When you compare where we are today to where those guys were, yo. So it was a fun book for me to read, very different.
Mm-hmm.
The next one coming up, I've got something in the works. I don't exactly know what it is yet. Can't really say too much more about it because it might go in a very different direction. But there will be another one. And every time I write a book, I say, well, this is the last book I'm going to write. And then I get another idea. So I have no idea when this machine is going to stop.
Well, I that book sounds really interesting, and I definitely will be a customer when that comes out. It sounds very exciting. Bob, thank you very much for doing this.
Oh, sure.
I really appreciate it. Glad we could make it work. And really quick before we head out, for people who want to get in touch with you, I know we mentioned your Twitter, but is there any other avenue for people to come in contact with you, or is Twitter the best way?
Twitter's not a bad way, what at Uncle Bob Martin, I guess it is. And let's see, my website is cleancoder.com. And the videos that I do, I've done a whole bunch of videos now. They're on a different website, cleancoders.com. Um, but I mean, if you just do a network search on Uncle Bob, you'll see an awful lot of ways to get in touch with me. So I'm pretty easy to get in touch with,
Mm-hmm.
as I think you found out.
I will also include I'll include a link to your Twitter handle and your website
Okay.
in the description of the video so people can find that. And yeah, no, thanks again. This was a lot of fun. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, fun for me too.
And for everybody else out there, thank you very much for listening. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.